Afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, it's my pleasure to welcome you here. As you'll see, this is being recorded, so we're expecting something great, I guess. Anyway, the idea is the Premier will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we've got questions until he has to leave at 2. It's probably a bit of a truism to say that Barry doesn't need any introduction, so I'm not going to introduce him, except I'm going to say a little bit about how we met. It goes, and here we are in the P.P. McGuinness Library with Paddy staring down at us from over there, and Paddy had something to do with this, and the story goes like this. Back in 1993, our annual lecture, the John Bonython Lecture, was given by Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian novelist, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature a couple of years ago. Paddy was there, and it was a large audience at the Sheraton Hotel, and I don't know if it was next day or not, he writes a column which sort of commented on the political representation in the room. It's about 500 or 600 people or whatever the hotel holds there. And he commented that the place was full of Labor Party figures, but he couldn't, I think Jim Carlton might have been there, but he couldn't really find many from the other side. And he wrote about this, talking about the Conservatives, Liberals, whatever you want, they were a bunch of Philistines. And Barry rings me the next morning, because at the time he was secretary or director or whatever the title is of the Liberal Party in New South Wales. And he said, I fear they're right. He's right. Subsequently, of course, Barry became a member of the State Parliament, and he has been my local member in various ways for most of that time. And of course, became Premier and won a record landslide election last year. There was at the end of the story goes to show that Barry's not a Philistine, was that when Jenny and I were at the opera earlier this year, and we ran into the O'Farrells and said, oh, you should come to lunch. And I said, of course I'll come to lunch. So that's ending the Philistine story, so now we can hear Barry talk about what he has to talk about. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Greg. 2 things. My wife likes opera. And because she comes to lots of things she hates, I go occasionally too. I don't hate it, but it's not first choice. And secondly, I absolutely would have told you at the time, Greg, that I feared that Paddy was right, because it was around that time that Bill Heffernan became president of the Liberal Party of New South Wales, Bevan Bradbury having died. And Bill, who is known to some of you in this room for his late night phone calls and streams of consciousness, had just got off the phone to Gerard Henderson to tell Gerard that he'd never read a book in his life. And I said, Bill, you know that man writes a weekly column, don't you? So there are Philistines in the Liberal Party. Bill's not quite as bad as he pretends to be, but anyway, we are trying to root them out. But I've got other problems, Greg. Look, firstly, can I say I'm pleased to be here. I feel really embarrassed because I haven't been here since they remodelled the library, which Greg tells me is almost a decade ago.
No, it's only 3 years.
I know. But I simply want to thank all of you in this room for philanthropically supporting the Institute, the Centre, sorry, because it is important. It's important because of the work that they do, and the work they do is important for us, because one of the ongoing discussions that I've had from time to time with Greg is how the Centre influences government, and I've had most of those discussions in opposition. And there is no doubt that when, as today, they're out there advocating radical reform in relation to the way in which governments tackle the problems of Indigenous education, or the way to better deliver Indigenous education, that it does have an impact. And it's also clear that when people like Jennifer Buckingham and others have worked around the Centre for so long and have got to know people in various guises in opposition and in government, that they do have a far bigger impact when we're there and we're wondering, in those wonderful initials that I use occasionally, WTF, what is the solution here? Because too often, Greg, we know the goals you want to get to. The great challenge of government that I learned about day 2 was it looks easy, and getting through the 329,000 individuals who are there to help us called the New South Wales Public Service is not always easy. Can I thank Greg too for the work that it does on the publication side, in particular for its making possible the condensed version of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nation by Eamon Butler. Because I'm sure that there are many in this room who, like me, would confess not to have read Smith's work from cover to cover. But I do hope that, like the Reader's Digest version of The Road to Serfdom, it'll similarly sell 10 million copies and make those enlightened ideas available to a newer generation who increasingly want their thought lines in digestible forms, if not the 140 characters that go with Twitter. I also want to thank the Centre and Greg for introducing me to another Smith, Bruce Smith, through Greg Malusha's wonderful facsimile edition of his work, plus the introductory essay. And perhaps, Greg, you might be inspired to do a condensed version of Liberty and Liberalism as your next project, because I'd certainly buy a copy. So that's by way of introduction, and you know what the Centre is on about: private property ownership, free markets, promoting individual choice and responsibility, accountability in government are all important. And I assume that not just in audiences like this that they're largely accepted. So I was surprised early this month to read in The Australian the results of a survey that showed that only 39% of Australians aged between 18 and 29 thought that democracy was better than any other form of government. So 1 in 3 young people ambivalent or negative about democracy, and more Indonesians than Australians thinking that democracy was preferable to any other form of government. So I have to say that I never thought in my lifetime I'd have to consider how we go about re-prosecuting the virtue of democracy to young Australians. But I think it's a wake-up call for us all, a wake-up call that we take at our peril for granted, our freedoms, our democracy and our classical liberal values. So we need to continue to make the case, or complacency is ultimately going to erode those values that we hold dear. So today, you know, half a week after the autumn parliamentary session finished, it's a good opportunity to reflect on the obligations that we accepted as a government more than a year ago through the democratic process, and to examine the challenges we face delivering that mandate through another artefact of that democracy, the Legislative Council. And I say that not as an excuse, but as an assessment of the reality we face in implementing our commitments, many of which do require, as you would have seen last week, legislative change. Now, there's no doubt that democracy is messy, but we have to respect democracy, and we have to respect the parliamentary complexions that democracy delivers, because it does fundamentally reflect the views and the will of voters. We have to work as a government pragmatically within the environment in which we find ourselves, and as far as possible deliver the will of the people who gave us their support to implement the big changes that were clearly necessary across the state. So our approach has been threefold: to deliver on our commitments, to set out the strategic priorities openly and to work to that plan, and to measure our performance against the strategic plan that we've produced, so that we can make good governments respect, so we can make the case that good governments respect their mandate, deliver it, and produce measurable benefits for citizens in accordance with the objectives for which those citizens actually voted. So if I go to firstly delivering commitments, I think my government, probably me in particular, will be the first state government actually criticised for being so zealous about delivering our commitments. I think there have been more editorials in the Daily Telegraph written about my determination to stick to the commitments we made than on any other issue. And that's important, not the editorials. It's important, I think, because one of the challenges that we faced as we assumed government was to try and restore some public confidence in government across New South Wales, confidence eroded by governments, successive governments that had promised certain things and failed to deliver. And you know, if we do deliver the election commitments we set out prior to March last year, we'll be the first government in a long time, because you know Nick was unable to deliver his because of the circumstances that he found when he was elected. And whilst it's become trite and too easy an excuse these days to say, oh, we can't do that because of the conditions, Nick genuinely found those conditions and was the first, I suppose, of the governments around this country after 1988 that fell into that fashion. Well, the bad news is that whilst it still remains true, whilst we confronted a $5 billion deficit, we knew that if we simply rested on that excuse, we would be condemned in our first week in the same way as a tired Labor administration had been condemned. So for us, restoring trust was important. So in our second budget, delivered just a fortnight ago, we continue to allocate resources to the North West Rail Link and enable the delivery of policy commitments that include tackling the cost of living, importantly through greater efficiency of our electricity distribution networks, and I thank Roger for his work there, addressing housing affordability to help Mr O'Neill, with more inevitable investment in housing infrastructure in Sydney and across our regions to enable faster land releases, a new planning system including a vehicle called Urban Growth New South Wales, which will assist through greater transparency and direct powers to boost investment, and delivering our commitments to invest in more teachers, especially on this day I should acknowledge that, more nurses and more police, and better customer services across the whole of government. First, amongst equals in our strategic goals is of course to grow the state's economy, and that means getting off the backs of business and letting them compete better. And we know that the remedy starts at home in the public sector, and we've already started to improve public sector productivity, including through our wages and excess employees policies. We know that by employing the discipline of contestability across government, including franchising of transport services, we've started with ferries, leasing port and water infrastructure, and corporatising state forests, will deliver better benefits for both taxpayers and users of those services. We're continuing to drive efficiencies in the public sector, which became even more imperative when 8 weeks before we delivered the budget we were handed the bad news from the federal government of a $5 billion collapse in the GST revenues expected to be received by New South Wales. Our fiscal policy is driven by a commitment to maintain and retain our AAA credit rating and to keep expenses within revenues, and to resist the historic temptation to reach for the revenue dial instead of winding back expenses. Peter Seaton does a marvellous job for me, but she failed today because she bought me one of the newsletters that we put out with the budget. She didn't bring me my favourite one, which just highlights something that I don't think we get credit for, and something that Mike Baird and all of my ministers deserve credit for. We are the first government in 17 years to bring our expense budget in on budget. So for 17 years, we've roughly spent $500 million to $1 billion more than was outlined in our budgets each year. And this year, last year for the first time, or this current financial year for the first time, we've actually brought our expense budget in. And as I said to Belinda when I sat down, just imagine what we could have done with our budget if we hadn't have had that $5 billion bad news blow from the federal government that relates, in a sense, to the lack of national confidence and our economic situation. So, Peter, you're forgiven, but we'll make sure you get a copy, Greg. The effect of getting expenses back under control, the effect of sitting through countless expenditure review committee meetings, encouraging Treasury or discouraging Treasury from reaching for the revenue dial when it seeks to fill some gaps, is that we have been able to reduce some taxes and to maximise our ability to borrow responsibly to invest in economic infrastructure. Our objective is to reduce the cost of doing business in New South Wales. We understand the competitive pressures that exist within Federation and that we need to address, and to enable the creation of wealth and employers of people to sharpen their competitive edge and the opportunities that go with it. Healthy businesses and strong gross state product returns more revenue to government to invest in community services and priorities than any new tax ever will. Another major break on New South Wales business and jobs was the troubled work cover scheme. We got a report in February that showed that at the end of the last year it was a deficit of $4.1 billion and growing. It had grown by $1.7 billion over the previous 6 months. That reform was necessary, or else premiums would increase by 28%. And the State Chamber estimated that a 28% increase in premiums would not only drive some businesses to the wall, but would cost around 12,500 jobs. So we finally got our changes through at the ungodly hour of 2:39 last Thursday morning, but we will now have legislation in place for a scheme that will help get injured workers back to work, that will provide greater benefits for those who are totally incapacitated, and I think most importantly of all, puts in place for the first time in New South Wales a work capacity test, because work cover was never meant to be a scheme that gave to injured workers the right for lifetime income support. It was always meant to be a scheme. The way it's run by those industries that are able to be self-insurers is to get people back to work, because that's good for them, it's good for the industry, it's good for the employer, and ultimately it's good for taxpayers. So in terms of our strategic priorities, Greg, unlike the real world, the $60 billion organisation that is the New South Wales government worked without any coherent strategic planning or performance budgeting. So money was simply spent on the basis of where people thought it was a good idea. That's how we had $500 million spent on what was to be a two-stop metro from the city to Rozelle, $500 million spent without a single centimetre of rail track being built. Or at the very least, there was no strategic plan that an ASIC would actually recognise. So last September we released New South Wales 2021, my government's 10-year strategic plan, which has 32 goals and 180 measurable targets. There was a great intake of breath around the cabinet when we signed off on it, because we know that when you set targets you're going to have to live against them. But like all responsible businesses, whether listed companies or NGOs, the performance of the New South Wales government is now subject to the disciplined performance management that you'd expect, with cluster directors accountable for their financial and service outcomes against their KPIs, and ministerial accountability for their achievements against strategic plan individually and at cabinet. So you would have heard some of the fuss after the budget that we booked $1.2 billion worth of program savings, and we haven't detailed which programs, and that's absolutely right, because what we've said to ministers and cluster directors is we've apportioned it, that you will find savings to the tune of this amount in your portfolios over the next 12 months, and they will. The problem in the past has been that when Treasury has dictated where it'll come from, inevitably great seams of waste and mismanagement in the bureaucracy have been missed. So we think it's best to empower managers to manage and hold them to account. Plans, of course, are only as good as the discipline in measuring and accounting for their performance. So in this budget we released our first New South Wales 2021 performance report. And I think we have a copy here, do we not, Peter? There'll be questions at the end of my speech. It progresses reports, it tracks progress against our 2021 document. I have to say that it shows some progress, it shows in some areas difficulties, and it shows in some areas a failure to be able to work out, this is what perplexes Peter Seaton and I most of all, how we can actually put a measurable target and a meaningful target. They're really good at putting targets that aren't meaningful, but a meaningful target around some of these areas. It aligns, for instance, for the first time our strategic priorities in the budget process to ensure that our resources are allocated to the programs, initiatives and services necessary to deliver our commitments, but also to reach the goals that we've set ourselves. Well before last year's election, we committed to be honest and upfront about how we were going, and to try and change the culture of government that said that if in trying to achieve a worthwhile outcome people stuffed up, they wouldn't necessarily be subject to the usual scorn or even dismissal that had previously happened. We're interested in getting change that delivers better outcomes. We're interested in innovation. We're interested in trying to empower people who particularly are delivering services at the front line to innovate, and you can only do that in a culture that actually encourages that as opposed to penalise it. We've got more work, as I said, to do to finalise some of the new baselines to ensure our reporting is relevant to the community, and also for public sector managers. But I've got no doubt that you will see from time to time in the Telegraph, in the Australian, and the Herald, great stories about how we're failing in X, Y, and Z. Well, I'm less concerned about initial snapshots than I am as to tracking progress, because ultimately, if the line's heading in the right direction, I'll be satisfied. If the line's heading in the wrong direction, there'll be backsides that'll be kicked at both ministerial and departmental levels. But if you don't measure it, you don't know where you're going. And of course, all of this will help give people a better opportunity as to how to judge us come that next election in 2015. Greg, back to democracy. Those who delivering these commitments and hitting those performance targets in many cases, or delivering the targets and delivering the commitments, hitting the targets, often requires legislative change that did with the work cover change. So the issue that we grapple with around the cabinet table most Monday afternoons more than often is whose mandate are we respecting? Is it the mandate of the government or a minority party on the crossbench? And you know, so for instance, we said that we'd hold an inquiry into the future of the state's electricity industry. We did. We said that we would follow its course in terms of a path forward. We have. Part of the path forward was to sell the generators, the development sites, and the proceeds from that sale, of course, would assist us with the infrastructure backlog in New South Wales. So we had to make a pragmatic decision in order to get that legislation through a hostile upper house in order to deliver the overarching commitment that we were committed to. And I have to say, an approach that was consistent with our general policy to involve and extend the involvement of the community and volunteers in more aspects of services in the public domain. So enlisting licensed restricted shooters to assist with our feral pest eradication programs in rural and regional, 79 rural and regional parks and reserves makes good conservation sense. It happens in Victoria, it happens in New Zealand, it happens in South Australia, but it's certainly not something that we ever envisaged happening in metropolitan parks, even though, Greg, I can tell you that it currently happens through National Parks and Wildlife in our local national park, Lane Cove National Park. If I can, I'm not sure where this podcast is going, Angus, but I was down in Lane Cove National Park 7 years ago. You've been interested in this, Stephen, because it's close to the university as well. And Arthur Willis was the general manager in those days. He's now at Kosciuszko. And he was talking to me about ferals, and I thought I heard him say something. He said, "Tell me that again." He said, "Yes, we shoot rabbits and foxes and things." And I said, "I've never heard it." He said, "No, we use silencers." And I said, he said, "We use contractors or staff." I said, "But why don't I see it?" He said, "We do it before dawn." And because those of you who know, particularly West Linfield, Greg, I said, "What about the joggers who run before dawn?" He said, "We haven't got one yet." Which is a true story, which I've resisted telling at any of the press conferences where I've had to defend, the decision to allow volunteer shooters to assist in our national parks. But it has quelled some of the diatribe I've had from local residents, Greg, but not you, about the issue in my own electorate. So back to democracy and the prosecution of enlightened classical liberalism. It is the responsibility of those of us who value things to defend and proclaim them in a world that increasingly offers myriad and often fleeting benefits from competing intellectual and political constructs. So for people like me whose job can be as prosaic as making sure that roads are fixed, trains run on time, while the lights actually turn on, in a world which my contribution has to be to make the products of democracy, free people and good government, relevant to those people who live in it. The fact that 1 in 3 people in Australia apparently don't think it's the best system is a huge challenge, I think, for all politicians at state and federal level. Those people might choose at some point in the future to act in that belief. And Greg Malouche, this time writing about education, says that every citizen of a democratic society should possess some knowledge of history, and he's entirely right. So those of us with knowledge and experience of history, those of us who value what we've learned, have a responsibility to take as many opportunities as possible to prove our contention. So if we don't like the shape of a parliament that our democracy gives us, then we have to work harder and more persuasively to convince people of the virtue of our cause, including the fundamental value of democracy. That means, come the next election, I've either got to convince people to give us a majority in the upper house, or I have to open that age-old debate about whether we should have an upper house. But I know that people in this room do care and do exactly that. And to reassure Gary Banks, who at the start of this week said there ain't such thing as a free lunch anymore, acknowledge that at least the CIS supporters in this room have today paid for lunch. So I thank you as a free citizen for supporting Greg Lindsay and his team and the important work they do in reminding us of the values of a liberal democracy. And I thank you for being another welcome point of pressure, Greg, and the Centre, for encouraging my colleagues and I to continue to make the tough decisions needed to deliver the reforms for New South Wales. I can do this, Greg. You, you just point.
Yeah, so
I'll take questions on anything.
Yeah.
Anything except shooting in Lanco National Park.
Barry, I've just had a quick glance at this, and on the transport cluster,
Yep.
and I think we all live with city traffic, and I know that's one of your issues, but I see nothing here on M5 East. What's happening with that car park between Littlefield and...
Well, the good news is that I was berated by Alan Jones this morning because we've just signed the contract to widen the M5 West. That's the bit that goes from King George's Road out to the Southern Highlands. 40% of traffic coming in each morning gets off before King George's Road, so that will have some benefit. Why are we doing that bit? Well, that's the only bit that's tolled at the present time because the former government thought it was a good idea not to toll the other bit. So it was much easier to deal with the private sector to fix that, and Alan was upset not because we're doing it, but because it's going to take 2 years to do it, because trying to renovate infrastructure that's currently being used always takes a bit longer than doing it in the first place. So the short answer is that in September, Infrastructure New South Wales will deliver to us the 20-year infrastructure strategy, which will, we could in 10 minutes around here list all the projects need to be done in Sydney. The hard part, the skill that we're looking to Infrastructure New South Wales to do, is to give us the order in which they should be done on the basis of their economic benefit to the state. Because ultimately we've got limited dollars. Inevitably the funding for those projects will be a combination of public-private partnerships, and we need to ensure that every dollar we invest is as soon as possible going to reap additional dollars for New South Wales through economic growth. So that's the reason that those things aren't in that report. Hopefully when you see it next year, who knows, Greg might invite me back next year. Hopefully when you see it next year there'll be some reference to M5 East. But whether it's M5 East, whether it's M5, M4, F6, F3 to M2, you name it, I've got a road that has to be built. The roads and rail alone in Sydney add up to $30 billion. And that's before I get out of the, get across the Hawkesbury, across the Nepean, or across the Highlands. That's what gets me out of bed every day. Sir.
Premier, you mentioned 320,000 public
329,000. Can I tell them my favourite story, Peter?
Yeah, do, please.
We are. It's the second, isn't it? We are allegedly. But actually, no. Peter came in to see me. Peter Seaton works for me. She's heads my strategic projects, which means she's the. Actually, I don't know the Soviet role that you would have taken, Peter, but Peter's the one that tries to keep 329,000 people pointing in the same direction. But someone had actually told her very proudly that we were the 8th largest employer in the world. And her reaction was exactly the same as my reaction. In case you're wondering, China Light and Power are the largest employer in the world, but it is just extraordinary.
Yeah, they've got more than
Anyway, I'm just amazed.
Yeah, well, I thought it went through to the fence. That's why.
No, 329,000. So we announced last year 5,000 voluntary redundancies. We've announced the equivalent of another 10,000 this year. We are part of the program savings. We'll see programs go. Contestability will see programs go. You may have seen a very small piece in today's Telegraph. There may be a Telegraph reader in the room. Probably more Telegraph readers than Herald readers, actually. Now that I think about it. But Sydney water unions are about to cut up rough, having been given the green light by Fair Work Australia to take some action about work practices. And as I said at a meeting last night, make my day, because we have contingency plans in place that they're threatening to go on strike for 4 days. We have contingency plans in strike, that means that if potholes open up in roads, if water's locked off, the private sector will come in and do it. And I could think of no better example of the benefits of contestability, the benefits of the private sector being able to do what allegedly can only be done by the public sector. So I hope they go on strike for a long time.
Mr. Premier, you mentioned a massive amount of money being spent before a stick of rail was being laid. In all of our projects, and considering the huge budget that you have, how can we cut down on the cost without sacrificing quality of all of this study that's done by an ever-increasing number of consultants without attracting we make a saving there and get it into the project itself?
Absolutely, and it's a challenge that we have, and it's a challenge that's being addressed not just within the planning framework, which you'll see in the next couple of weeks, but in part driven by Infrastructure New South Wales. So there's a number of problems in New South Wales. Firstly, you know, well, the EIS for the Northwest Rail Link is that wide. There's about 8 publications, and I know, you know, I'm a 36-pound weakling, but I couldn't lift it with one hand. Gladys had no hope, but it just demonstrates, you know, it demonstrates in one sense the rigour, but I suspect the unnecessary rigour that has to be gone through in order to get projects up and running. You know, as a local member, I'm yet to see, and I look at Paul when I say this because Paul understands local developments. You know, I've never seen a traffic report put in by a proponent that has ever said it's going to lead to traffic consequences. You know, so why do we do this? So Infrastructure New South Wales is challenging some of those. It's also looking at the issue of bidding costs for major projects as well, because that's a big issue as well. But we are trying to challenge all of these things and make it as simple as possible. But you know, 329,000 people have found a myriad of ways in order to justify their jobs, and that's nowhere clearer than in the planning space, and frankly and regrettably in the environmental space, because some of the, you know, regulations can be necessary. What I find absolutely unacceptable is what happens every day in country areas across this state, where the same regulation will be interpreted differently by different officials working for the same agency, the Office of Environment and Heritage, and that has an enormous consequence for whether it's an individual farmer or whether some of the agri-businesses that are across the state. Paul.
Barry, can you give us a feel for the likely of working out of the freight forwarding contest out in the southwest? It was many years ago that people woke up to the fact that a rail conduit from Botany to a freight forwarding depot was essential, a missing part of the, you know, the infrastructure. Yep. And now we've got this ridiculous situation of Albanese and his ideal and the private sector funded project. Where's that all going?
Well, I think the net effect of it is going to be to push out 2, 3, 4 years the delivery of a project that the private sector under Stockland and now under the other bloke, you know, was just about ready to go. The bad news is that in order for the private sector project to be up and running, a small slither of land is required to be released by the federal government, and I have no doubt that now that Defence and Finance and Albanese think that there's millions of dollars to be made through a government development, that's unlikely to be offered. Now we're seeking that. I've written to Gillard saying that this should be sorted out by Rod Eddington and Nick Reiner, and we've been told to go hang.
Can that be reversed and that lost time recovered after the next?
Well, we certainly hope so, because we now have an extra interest in it. We're trying to lease Port Botany, as well as dispose of Port Kembla, and you know, the throughput from Botany, of course, would be going to this Moorebank facility. In an ideal world, Paul, you know, if it was south of Moorebank, it'd be even better. But the fact is, we just need a facility up and running. And this current proposal involves Enfield, it involves Moorebank. It'll get more containers and freight onto rail to those areas to operate as a distribution hub, which will help with the not the M4 East, but with the M5 extension. Because you know, every time I use the M5, there's a stoppage, and I'm sure that's the case for many people around this room, around the city.
Premier, I suppose people will say, well, I've got a vested interest in this.
We all have vested interests, we're citizens.
The M5 pretty regularly, but I'm very pleased to see that the contract's been let for the bit from Camden Valley Way to King. That's only going to make the problem worse. It's not going to solve the problem without the tunnel. I mean, it's not just the rail link that Paul's talking about. It's the road to that corridor, which, unless you make some announcement, I think leasing Port Botany is going to be a hard job.
Well, the issue is, as I say, September is when the strategy will come out. M4, M5, F3, M2, F6 are all going to be on the strategy. I think, if you're looking at it from economic impact terms, it's pretty clear which one will be closest to the top, but this is being done arm's length from government because our commitment was to have an arm's length expert body put together the strategy away from government, because otherwise government picks and chooses the ones that are politically palatable as opposed to those that are necessary for the state's economy. That's how you lose $500 million on a rail line. Perversely, and I know it's hard to get your head around, but if you're coming into the city of a day or going home of an afternoon and you're part of that 40% of traffic that joins at King George's Road, your travel times from King George's Road out of an evening will be quicker, and your travel times on the way in will be quicker to King George's Road. I accept that the tunnels need to be done. That's the big problem. You'll all remember the story that Wild King offered to for a fraction of the price we're going to have to pay to build the extra tunnels, extra lanes at the time of the original construction, and was told no by the then government. Part of the challenge for us, and this is something that we had to look at in opposition, was that at a time when we were building, Nick Reiner was building two-lane tollways. He built the M2, of course, which was the first. Victoria was looking at 4 lanes, and I spoke to Mark Burrell, who was the infrastructure minister down there, and they said Cabinet just understood that we could build the cheaper version and be politically popular because the toll was lower, or we could go for the future. And that's what our government's going to have to address as well, and that's what we're trying to do, for instance, with the North West Rail and the decision last week to run it as a metro service, which doesn't need timetables, which caused a bit of political pain, will nevertheless still continue to cause some political pain, but is absolutely the right thing to do.
Can I just, first of all, just draw your attention to the Greeks? Because I think if you surveyed the Greeks, I think they invented democracy. Probably one even worse than 37%. To a question, a sort of general question. In your electoral mandate, whatever your party policy, you did what a lot of politicians do around the world, and they promise more doctors, more police, more health workers.
Yeah.
And Cameron, you name it, they all do it. Does that not actually then essentially make it very difficult for you to actually start doing what we're all doing in business and actually trying to drive through productivity improvements in all those sectors? Because, the world has changed fundamentally. 100 employees cost you 10 million a year, rule of thumb. And at the moment you're locked in at that level, it's very hard then to start get productivity out of teachers, doctors, and which is something that has to be done.
Partly, it is a good question, and you would think that the answer was yes, it does create those problems, except for the fact that over the next 20 years we're expected to increase our population by 1 million. So population growth, in a sense. So there are now 760,000 kids at 2,200 public schools across the state. That's up from last year. Growth is again apparently greater in the non-government sector. Every time there's a financial hiccup, it reverses, but it's again showing this year that it's been stronger in the non-gov sector. But population growth means that we do need more nurses, teachers, and police, which are the 3 commitments we made. So we're very clear about that. We didn't promise a whole lot of other people in other professions, including in those sectors, and nor is it stopping us trying to get greater efficiency out of them. So part of the issue the teachers are out there striking, or some of the teachers are out there striking about today, is that they know that more is going to be expected. And what's interesting is it's some of the younger and newer teachers who have different expectations to some of the older and more established teachers who are embracing the challenges we're given. The other thing is, of course, if you're a principal, except for some of the harder line Federation delegates, you do support this. The minister's met with all of the principals in different forums, and he said overwhelmingly they all support these powers to give, because 2,200 schools. Albury is different to Austinmere, is different to Bega and places. Schools in Ku-ring-gai might be like schools, but schools in Campbelltown and schools in Kempsey will be different, and allowing principals to make decisions around those schools that better reflect community attitudes is a good thing. So, but we do, we are, part of our key is to, and we introduced it this year, is to look at employee expenses and to put some real caps as to how much we're going to spend on employee expenses. And when you've got a police force where more than half of your costs relate to employee costs, there's a reason why we do that.
Well, I mean, you've partly answered the question. In a way, part of the challenge in the first term is that as you liberate stakeholders, like you are with school principals, you are liberating groups that are as yet unwilling to come out in support of the government. Hopefully your task will become easier as these things take hold and stakeholders come out. I mean, how are you seeing that? I was interested in school principals because they, I know some that feel very liberated. Are they prepared to come out, do you think?
Well, if you look at when we announced the local schools local decisions policy, it was the Primary School Principals Association, the Secondary School Principals Association who stood beside us and supported it. So the federation's a union. The other two are groups that essentially are professional groups of members, of people that might be still members of the union, but they're not running a union agenda. The union hates this idea because the union prefers to have a couple of people sitting in Bridge Street, which is education headquarters in Sydney, helping to control the show. By devolving 70% of education spending down to schools, currently it's about 25%, that's a lot harder for the union to try and keep close control on everything. So you're absolutely right that people like it. And the minister, who in opposition was accused of being too close to the federation, very cleverly though was also close to the two professional associations, principal associations, and has very cleverly been able to use them as the counterpoint. But of course the unions will always get the attention. You'll be told tonight that every teacher went out. Well, that's not true. There are schools across Sydney that, whilst not running as schools, have certainly operated today, and certainly parents have been able to send their kids along to be minded. Even though apparently the rules require every parent to send a note tomorrow as to why their kids weren't at school today. But can I just make a point to you though Greg, that I made to Belinda when I sat down, was that Belinda of course chairs QBE, and I wasn't having a shot at her, but when we take on things like work cover reform, the response of business was pretty pathetic. So we're out there arguing the case for reform, and there is no chorus standing beside us. And so Peter Seaton had to go to enormous lengths to get certain people to make submissions to the parliamentary inquiry, which we were committed to. We had to have a parliamentary inquiry, and of course you can't have a parliamentary inquiry that only hears from one side, because it's pretty hard then to put sensible recommendations on the table. And so what we do need at times, and I was saying to Belinda, certainly the BCA under Jennifer Westacott and the last two chairs have really smartened up their acts at a federal level, and I've been really impressed by them. But at a state level, the peak bodies, and I don't want to insult anyone in this room perhaps because I'm not sure who's here, but the peak bodies and individual businesses have been hopeless. And Peter, am I being too harsh? I don't think I am.
We had support from the Sydney Business, the New South Wales Business Chamber, and certain sectors of the of small business like panel beaters, and people got very excited. But it was very hard to motivate the broad range of industry stakeholders that one would expect to want to respond to the issue. Yes.
So I'll never expect business to be like the union movement for a Labor government, but it would just be nice at times if business understood that, if and I don't expect pats on the back, but if we're about to tackle an issue as difficult as work cover is, if they could be out there in the media in all its forms, arguing the same case, or even arguing a case that was far more drastic, as I always like to look like a moderate, far more drastic, it would help. It would help a lot. But I am also, can I just say, Greg, finally, I am an incrementalist, and I make no apology for being an incrementalist. One of the greatest things that happened was the high-speed ferries to Manly fell over. Essentially, they needed replacing. The government hadn't invested. This is before the change of government, and we put pressure on, and they put in place a private contract. And unions threatened that everything would happen and it'd be hopeless. It's worked really well. Anyone who lives in Manly knows that it's reliable, it hasn't missed a day's service, all that sort of stuff. So that helped us with our pledge to franchise ferry services. Selling off long-term leases of Botany and Kembla going well help us with other privatisations. Getting a toll road right for a change, as opposed to what's happened the last three, might start to renew public support for public-private partnerships. And the ferry stuff may well translate ultimately into the rail system, and you will have seen last week again, we not only said that the North West Rail will be a metro system, we also said that it will be operated by the private sector, even though it will integrate into the system. So we are starting to tackle some of those things, but we need them to work. So we know that we can't afford to cross-city tunnel stuff up, because that'll be used by our opponents, by the media and by all the sceptics out there, many of which live in our seats, as an excuse for not going down this path.
Thanks, Barry. I'd just now like to call on Belinda Hutchison, our Deputy Chairman, to close the proceedings. Thank you, Belinda.
Pleasure, Greg. And Premier, thank you very much for taking the time today to come and speak to us. I agree with you on the work cover issues, and I think we do need to do more, and we need to stand up and counter. We did a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of the reforms. There's still, we think, quite a long way to go in terms of those reforms, but it's a very big start, and a very big start in the right direction, and we really appreciate your support on that. But I wanted to say that I think we all realised when the Premier took over in New South Wales, he had some big challenges and his team had some big challenges. However, I don't think we really understood how big those challenges were. And I think, the numbers like the 329,000 employees, the $60 billion budget, just are the tip of the iceberg. And when the Premier took over, I received a call one day on my mobile from another mobile, which I didn't recognise, and the voice said, "This is Barry O'Farrell." And I thought, wonder which of my children's playing a bit of a joke on me today. And but it wasn't actually a joke. It was actually a very serious request, and that was that Barry was looking to put together a commission of audit to really look at what was the problems that we had in the state of New South Wales in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of the way we delivered services. So, thinking that was a pretty important task, I agreed to sign up, and Kerry Schott, who was the ex-CEO of Sydney Water, was tasked with actually putting together a team to review really across all of the 9 clusters of governments: health, education, family and services, transportation, justice, correctional services, really across the whole range of government. Where were the problems? What needed to be done? And in 6 months, that team did an absolutely outstanding job and put together 2 reports, one which has already been delivered and released, which is online, which I think is an excellent piece of work, and another which has got yet another 133 recommendations for reform. And when you looked at the inefficiencies and problems that the public sector face, it is an enormous challenge that the Premier and his team are taking on, and it is not going to be fixed in a day. I guess, I'm one of those people who want things done tomorrow, and I'm sure everybody else does. But the fact is, it's not going to be done tomorrow. It's going to take time, it's going to take investment, and things like infrastructure in New South Wales, they need to do the work. We need to be prepared. In terms of the management information systems we do not have in our government, it's impossible to actually achieve the reform unless you actually have that basic infrastructure that we expect in business does not exist in government. There is no performance management in the public service. There is no plan each year for each individual senior manager around what they need to do and around how they need to achieve it. And there is no review at the end of the year about whether they did it. So all of these basic things that we as businesses take for granted are just not happening. So I'm really impressed, Premier, with what you've done, and in terms of devolution of responsibility, it's absolutely key. What you're doing with education and the teachers and the principals is exactly what we need. What you've done with health in terms of the local district boards, empowering the management of those local district health services, absolutely critical. All of those things need to be done, and I just hope you can implement the 133 recommendations that Kerry and we put up as a team, because if we can do that, I do think over the next 5 years you will see a really substantial reform in terms of the New South Wales government, and I think we really are on the right track, and I want to thank you for all the hard work you're doing. So everyone, if you could just join with me in thanking the Premier.